Okay, well, welcome to the next video for Econ 351, or this will be the first full-length video. So this is lecture 1. Previous one was lecture 0, which was kind of the introduction. We're going to break this lecture into two parts to try to, well, the whole thing's probably going to be an hour and 15 minutes, so that makes for one really big video. So we're going to break this one in half and try to shoot for about a half hour. Now, as you're going through these, please get out a notebook. So I'll pause, push pause. Get out a notebook and a piece of paper. So as we're going through this, I'm going to stop or ask you to stop at a handful of places and to sketch things out. Then start back up again. All right, so let me do some rearranging here of these windows a little bit. That ought to be good about there. Maybe a little bit, try to make me a little bit smaller there. And that a little bit bigger so you can see it a little better. Okay, so this is this lecture is on the Riccardian trade model, which is usually where we start in international trade theory. It's the foundation for most of what we do in trade theory. It's an extremely simple model. It was developed in the early 19th century by David Ricardo. That's where it gets its name from. And David Ricardo wrote it up in a small pamphlet to urge British Parliament to liberalize trade in and out of Great Britain. Right? So it wasn't originally written up to be a textbook example or anything like that. It was designed to influence policy. And his model is quite simple, and we can develop it quite quickly here in just a couple of lectures. So before we get in too far to this model, it's worth talking for a few minutes about international trade in a very general sense. Why do we have international trade? Sometimes politicians speak as though international trade is something that should be avoided. Sometimes people in general speak that way. But of course, there's isn't politicians who forced anybody to engage in international trade, and it isn't business that required us to buy goods and services from the rest of the world. It's simple economic forces and individual preferences. So people want to buy different goods and services. We want to buy, in the United States, we want to buy mangoes. It's very difficult to grow mangoes in the United States, so generally you have to buy them internationally, right? They have to be shipped internationally. Similarly, due to just natural resources or different types of capital available, whether it be human capital or physical capital, it ends up being cheaper in some places to produce some items when compared to other places. So production of say glass is much less expensive in a hot environment with a lot of sand than it is in a cold environment with very little sand, for the simple reason that the resources are at hand, and as a consequence it becomes lower cost to produce in those types of environments. And so we get international trade, and several things happen as a result of that. First of all, we're able to get items that we wouldn't otherwise get, consume items that we wouldn't otherwise consume. Businesses are able to get inputs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. We're able to get these at lower costs than we would otherwise be able to do, and it allows us to specialize in certain other areas. And that specialization, of course, can bring advancements in productivity, which of course improves our real wealth, across society in general. Of course, it's also true that just moving people and goods and services around brings people into contact with other people, and understanding a diverse set of cultures and individuals can be a thing that has a great value in and of itself. Of course, people just like to experience new things and do new things too. So there's a lot of reasons, economic as well as social, why international trade is really a thing. Why the market can extend well beyond national boundaries. Okay, so as I mentioned, this first model, the Riccardian model of international trade, is one that most people are familiar with, whether they know it or not. You probably will recognize some of what we're talking about here. And David Ricardo's goal with this is to show that international trade can benefit all of a society, and that limitations on international trade can harm the majority of a society. And the hinge point, or the critical component of his explanation, is simply opportunity cost. Now, we're all familiar with opportunity cost. This is really the beginnings of it. So this is where the idea comes from originally, is from Ricardo's trade model. So there's the first part of the theory that you're already well familiar with. Opportunity cost, of course, is the foregone benefit of the best alternative prospect. So if I do X and my second best option was Y, what benefit would I have gotten from doing Y? That's the opportunity cost of doing X. Okay, so that idea is the central notion of Ricardian trade theory. If you can really lock that down in your head, you got a pretty good handle on how this model works. Now, Ricardo builds this idea of opportunity cost into an idea called comparative advantage. Okay. And let's take a look at that. You may have remembered comparative advantage. You might have learned about it in EC 103, heard about it elsewhere in other places. It's a concept very central to a lot of microeconomic analysis, since opportunity cost, of course, is embedded in all microeconomic analysis, and macro too, for that matter. So here we see the definition of opportunity cost given again, right? So familiar. And comparative advantage, which is structured right on top of that, so it's the same idea, is that if different nations can produce items at different costs, and we just talked about why that might be, right? It might be that they have different resources, might be that there's different types of capital available. In Ricardo's model, the reason for different costs is different productivities, right? So we're going to assume that maybe workers are more productive in one thing in one nation and in another thing in another nation. In other words, people are good at different things, right? So that's the sort of central assumption of the Riccardian model, is that people's abilities are different in different places. Okay. And so then comparative advantage is the idea that some people can do things by giving up less when compared to others. The nation that's able to produce a thing and give up the least, that is to say, produce at the lowest opportunity cost, is said to have a comparative advantage in the Riccardian model. All right, I'll say that again because it's super important. For sure, item 1 in your notes, right? Should be opportunity cost definition. Well, Riccardian model, right? Subject heading, opportunity cost, right? Now comparative advantage. Comparative advantage refers to the nation, exists within the nation that is able to produce a given item at the lowest opportunity cost. Okay, so for example, maybe every time nation A produces a widget, whatever, say a crate of bananas, okay, they have to give up producing, I don't know, how about a crate of oranges? And then, the other nation, every time they produce a crate of bananas, they have to give up 10 crates of oranges. Well, then the first nation clearly gives up less to produce a crate of bananas, and we would say they have a comparative advantage in that production, bananas. Okay? All right. This is the basis of the Riccardian model. All right. Now, most of the other trade models that we worked through in this class are going to be liberally stated extensions of the Ricardian model. Okay, so it's super important that you have an extremely solid foundation in this model before you proceed. You should be able to basically do every aspect of this thing on a napkin at the bar when it's 10:30 and you've already been there for a while. If you get the idea, right? Should be something that's just sort of hard written right into your being. Okay. It's also important to note that this idea of Ricardian trade really lays the intellectual foundation for most 20th century. I know we're well into the 21st century now, but that's a story for another day. Really lays the foundation for most 20th century trade policy. Okay, so here's the Riccardian model, right? Here's the bones of the thing. We're going to make some assumptions about how this works. The first of those is that we're going to have two nations. Now, the model is expandable to n number of nations. As long as we have a definitive number of nations, whether it be 2 or 2 trillion, the model will work, right? What we cannot have is we cannot have an unknown number of nations. Then the model is simply insoluble. Okay. Second, so here in your notes, right? Assumptions. Okay. All right, good. All right. Second thing, we have 2 goods, right? Also expandable to n number of goods, right? So as long as we have a defined number of goods or services, right, it's fine. The Riccardian model will work. If we have an undefined number of goods and services, the Riccardian model will not work. Okay. So we're going to start with 2 because 2's as low as we can go, right? And that makes it the easiest. Okay. All right. Finally, then, we're going to have 1 factor of production. That's right. So you might remember from EC 103, we normally talk about 3 factors of production. Don't worry, we'll get there again. Land, labor, capital. Okay. In the Riccardian model, we're going to have just labor. And that was really the norm in Ricardo's time. This is still the era of the labor theory of value, which if you're taking my history of thought class, we talk about a lot later on in the term, but this was normal at the time. And in particular, we're going to assume that further that labor has different productivities in each nation, right, as I mentioned a little earlier. And those different productivities are going to result in different opportunity costs, right? So some laborers are going to be very good at a thing relative to another set of laborers. All right. Additionally, we're going to assume for simplifications purposes, it's not absolutely necessary to do in a Riccardian model, but it's usually done, and certainly Ricardo did this. We're going to assume constant marginal productivity. That is, we're going to assume that if workers can produce 5 widgets an hour, they can always produce 5 widgets an hour. They can produce 5 widgets an hour when they start work at 8 a.m., and they're still producing 5 widgets an hour as the day comes to a close at 3 p.m. And if I add 100 more workers, they can produce 500 more widgets per hour because they all produce 5 widgets per hour in that nation, right? The other nation might produce 7 widgets an hour or whatever, right? But within a nation, if I add more labor, it can always produce the same amount. All right. So those are our assumptions, right? So it's not super complicated, right? It's not super realistic either. It's especially the last assumption, but other than that, it's it's pretty wide open, and because of that, its applicability is pretty high. It's applicable to a lot of situations. Okay, so let's throw some numbers at this and see how the model kind of works, right? Okay, and so as we go through this, I want you to do this on a piece of paper. So I'm going to kind of walk through this slowly. I'm going to yak a fair bit, right? I'm going to talk a fair bit. And, as I'm talking, you should be working on this and kind of listening a little bit in the background or something. So we're going to start by sketching out what's called a production possibilities frontier. All right, sometimes it's called a production possibilities curve. We probably learned about these in Econ 103 when you were talking about opportunity costs. If you didn't, pause this video right now and do a quick Google search, production possibilities frontier. Okay, pause. And we're back. Okay, so we're going to start by laying out a little production possibilities frontier that I would like you to draw in your notes based upon the data presented here. So let's say that the home nation, so we're going to draw one production possibilities frontier, second quadrant graph, right? We're going to label that production possibilities frontier home, okay, for the home country. And let's say that it can produce 400 of item A and 200 items of B with 10 units of labor. So on one axis, we're going to put a dot at 400, and on the other axis, we're going to put a dot at 200. Then we've got those 2 points. We're going to label that is with 10 units of labor, somewhere top, bottom, side, I don't care. And then we're going to draw a line between those 2 points, a straight line. Why are we going to draw a straight line? Pause for comments. And we're back. It's a straight line because the constant marginal productivity of labor, right? So as we shift from producing item A to producing item B, we shift at a constant rate, right? So if we produce less of A and more of B, we're going to shift at the constant rate given here, right? So what do we have? We have, for any given number of A or B, combination of A and B, whether it be all A, all B, or some mix in between, we have trade-offs, right? We have an opportunity cost, particularly with the numbers given, over there, with the numbers given over there, we can say that the opportunity cost of producing 1 of B is 2 of A. Or the opportunity cost of producing 1 of A is a half of B, right? So every time we produce 1 unit of A, we're giving up producing a half unit of B. So we have the opportunity costs of these two things. Now if you're thinking like, geez, it seems like kind of a pain because everything's relative, right? A relative to B, B relative to A. That's why international trade gets its own course. Okay, everything is relative in this class, all the way through, even when we get to international finance. Okay, everything is relative. And it's worth pausing to talk about this for a second. Okay, for a couple of reasons. First, everything is always relative. Okay, so this is the sort of most obvious thing, but we never talk about it, or we rarely talk about it in 103 or 104, right? But let's think about, your standard sort of market, like, in freshman economics, you might do something like the market for shoes or some sort of silly thing like this. Say, well, you draw a demand curve for shoes and a supply curve for shoes. What you never talk about is the shoes are being expressed relative to what? Money, right? Okay, so it's shoes in terms of money. You could draw a supply and demand curve for money in terms of shoes, right? So, if I have shoes and I want to sell shoes, how much money do I get, right? So we generally don't say that because in like EC 103, we express all goods and services in terms of a common form of money. In the United States, it's the US dollar, right? If you're learning this in Japan, it would be the Japanese yen. Okay? So all prices are expressed in the form of the common denominator of, if you will, of the local currency. All right, well, you can see where I'm going with this already. In international economics, there is no local currency. There are multiple local currencies, or multiple currencies relevant to the problem at hand. Okay, so because of that, because we have multiple currencies in the problem at hand, we end up expressing everything in a very explicit way in relative terms, right? And that that adds a layer of complication to everything. Now, the second reason why this is important, right, is it's very useful to remember this idea and to apply it to anything you would do in economics, right? We sort of sometimes take this idea like, oh, well, money is this kind of bedrock on which all economy lies, and so that common denominator within a nation is somehow secure or foundational, right? And that's not really correct at all. That's not really a correct way to think about how an economy functions, really at all. So, for example, let's say I'm holding an asset like a car or a house, right? And somebody says, "Oh my gosh, we're going to experience all this inflation," and let's say my only asset is the house. Do I care? I don't care about inflation, because the house, in terms of money, right? That just means that I'm going to get more money for my house than I did before, if there's inflation, right? So the price of the house, in terms of money, has risen, and the price of money in terms of houses has fallen. Okay, right. So the nature of a portfolio of wealth, whether it be an individual or a business, is always relative to money, and changes in the price of money relative to goods and services can be extremely damaging to an economy. But it's important that we understand what's going on with that. All right, so enough of the side note there. Let's keep rolling on the Riccardian model. So let's say that our foreign nation, so back here on this previous slide, right? So that one, right? That's our conditions for our home nation. So please draw that out, like I said. The slope of the function, the production possibilities function, should correspond to what you see there. Double check that. Pause. And we're back. Okay. For the foreign nation, similar. Draw it out. Okay. So the foreign nation can produce 600 of A and 200 of B. Yeah, 200 of B with the same 10 units of labor. So when compared to the home nation, it looks like the foreign nation is more productive in producing item A, right? 600 versus 400 out of the same 10 workers. And pretty much the same in terms of item B. It can both produce 200 items. Okay. From that, we can calculate our opportunity costs, right? And we can graphically show that with a PPF, right? If you don't like the graphs, I don't care. If you'd rather work it out mathematically, that's A-okay with me, right? In fact, you can see that's how I've done it. That's how I prefer to do it. But I find that a lot of students really like the graphs. Okay, so whatever works for you, as long as you know it by the time you're done. That's what I really care about. And I also know that when you write stuff down, you learn it better. All right, let's keep rolling. Okay, so we've got our home country, we've got our foreign country. Let's talk a little bit about where we are right now before we trade. Okay, so before the two nations trade, excuse me. So without trade in the home country, we know what prices are already in terms of A and B. Why? Because we already calculated them. They're the opportunity costs. Right? Okay, pause right here. And I want you to think about that for a few minutes. If we're making only A and B, and every time, and the same 10 workers can make A or B, right? Okay, then if you can make 2 A's or 1 B, then the price of A has to be 1/2 B. Why? Otherwise, markets are going to adjust until it is, right? The internal equilibrium price is such that when there's only one factor of production, right? If it takes twice as much labor to produce X as Y or A than B, then all things being equal, the price is essentially going to be double. All right. The wages, of course, have to equalize in both those industries, right? Whether labor is producing A or B, right? The wages have to equalize. Why? Because otherwise, if wages are higher in one industry than they are in the other, workers will just move there until, out of the first industry into the second industry. Until when? Until the wages equalize. So if the wages are equalized across both industries, it takes twice as many workers to produce one item, or twice as much worker time as it does to produce one item as the other. Then the cost of the first thing is going to have to be double the other thing. Okay? Don't go forward in this presentation until you're rock solid on understanding that. Okay? Because that kind of stuff, that kind of reasoning, like I just did, that's where you need to be right now to understand where the course is going to go. Okay? So this is on video, so if you need to rewind and watch what I just said a moment ago 3 or 4 times before you get it, sketch it out on paper, hey, go for it. That's one of the rare advantages of this type of learning. Okay. All right. So that's going to be the internal situation pre-trade, right? It's going to be dictated by labor productivity, right? And there's all kinds of implications of that, right? So it's like newscaster X calls you up and say you're an economist 10 years from now. News people, Americans are becoming more productive at blah, 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 blah. What do you think about this? Economist X. Well, they're getting richer in real terms because they can do more with less. The prices of the things they're consuming in terms of the work they have to put out is falling, right? So essentially stuff is getting cheaper relative to what? To work. Okay. All right, so that's the pre-trade condition. It's going to be applied to whether the home country or the foreign country, right? Those same ideas are going to hold either way. So, here this continues. Sort of looking at this example. By the way, these are, like teenage workers back in the day. I forget whether these are factory workers or mine workers or whatever. Smoking some cigarettes. Don't do that. Okay. And this is the last slide that we're going to look at in this lecture today, right? So we can see that sort of the status or the wealth of each of these nations is hinged upon the productivity of its labor, right? Now, the reason for this, of course, is because everything comes from labor in this model. And so the entire wealth of the nation, if I could borrow that phrase for a second, hinges upon the productivity of labor. The notion here, the idea that's being conveyed is, so you can go through the numbers here, right? Just poke around them on your own time. But the important thing to learn here is that the essence of this Riccardian model, which is super simple, I hope you'll agree. By the way, we're most of the way through it already, right? But the essence of this Riccardian model is that, conveys the truth that the real, and I'm using the word real here in the sense that we normally use that word in economics as in the material, the real wealth of nations is embedded in the productivity of the resources at hand, right? So if we only have labor to work with, the real wealth of a nation is all about the productivity of its labor. That basic notion is applicable to however many factors of production you want to apply, right? So let's say we had land, labor, and capital. The essence of a simple Ricardian model conveys to us in the most rudimentary terms that the real wealth of that nation is going to be a function of the productivity of its factors of production, in that case land, labor, capital. So in nations where land, labor, and capital are more productive relative to other nations, then the real wealth of that nation is going to be greater than it would otherwise be. Now, you might be saying, like, well, does that mean, countries with, good land are inherently richer? Maybe, but probably not. Probably not. Because, of course, some of those productivities are created, right? Hopefully you're creating productivity right now, right? So if you're able to learn these lessons, right, you will be more productive in most occupations, if not all, than you would have been before, right? And so where did that productivity come from? Well, it's, we created it. You and me, we created that productivity together. Okay, so productivity isn't something that just falls from the sky, right? That is given to us. No, we make it, right? We make it. We can choose to become more productive or not, right? We could choose to just sit around and watch reruns on TV all day. And of course, the essence of the Riccardian model would tell us that, you know, if we do that and other nations are enhancing their productivity, that over time they'll become, their real wealth will advance beyond ours, right? So that's, you know, quite a foundational lesson here that we get out of Ricardo, and it's by far the certainly not the last. So this is where we stand pre-trade in the Riccardian model, and that's the perfect place to, I think, pause this, and we'll pick it up on slide 11 in the second of these videos. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye.